The moment your eyes open, you know something is wrong. Not because of sound at first, but because of the cold. It presses against your skin in a way that feels deliberate, heavy, and alive. The air inside the shelter is still, yet sharp, carrying the faint smell of smoke, damp wood, and animal hide. Darkness surrounds you completely, the kind of darkness that exists only far from towns, far from lamps, far from anything human. Then the sound comes. A long, hollow howl sweeps across the mountains, rising and falling like a wounded animal. The wind slams into the walls of the shelter, testing every log, every seam, every decision that went into building this place. Snow scrapes across the roof in dry, whispering waves. A blizzard has arrived, sudden and absolute, sealing the world beyond these walls. You lie, still on a raised wooden platform, wrapped in thick buffalo robes layered one over another. They are stiff from age and use, but they hold warmth better than anything else you own. Beneath them, your body is suspended above the frozen ground, a small but critical distance that separates comfort from danger. Even here, the cold seeps upward, patient and persistent. The shelter is small, low-ceilinged, built from hand-cut logs stacked tightly together, their gaps packed with mud, moss, and whatever else could be pressed into service. There is no wasted space, no decoration, no softness. Everything around you exists for survival, and nothing more. Outside, the wind grows louder. It is not just cold out there. It is lethal. In this part of the Rocky Mountains, during deep winter, exposure is measured in minutes. A man caught in this storm without shelter would lose feeling in his hands before he could walk a mile. His breath would freeze in his beard. His thoughts would slow, then scatter, then fade. The mountains are very good at waiting inside. The temperature hovers just above freezing. By any modern measure, it would feel unbearable. Here, it feels like safety. Your eyes adjust slowly to the darkness. Against one wall, you can just make out the shape of the stone fireplace. The fire inside it has burned low. The flames are gone, replaced by a dull red glow buried beneath ash. You stare at it, counting breaths, feeling a quiet urgency settle into your chest. If the fire goes out, the shelter will follow. You shift beneath the robes, careful not to move too quickly. Every motion costs energy, and energy is warmth. Slowly, you push the heavy hides aside and swing your legs over the edge of the platform. Your feet slide immediately into leather moccasins placed exactly where you left them. The floor beneath is hard-packed dirt, frozen solid. Even through the moccasins, the cold bites. You stand, joints stiff, breath slow and controlled. As you straighten, a familiar ache blooms in your shoulder. An old wound, earned years ago and never quite healed. You've learned to listen to it. Tonight, it throbs steadily, deep and dull. Storm weather always finds it first. You cross the shelter in a few quiet steps and crouch beside the fireplace. A small stack of firewood rests close by, each piece carefully chosen and split. There is no randomness here. Too large a log would smother the embers. Too small would burn out before dawn. You select one piece and ease it onto the coals, nudging it gently into place. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the embers brighten. A thin flame appears, curling upward, testing the air. You wait motionless until it catches properly. Only then do you relax, just slightly. The fire grows, light spreading across the interior, shadows climbing the walls and retreating again. The shelter breathes. The walls crack softly as the temperature shifts. Somewhere outside, wind-driven snow finds a weakness and hisses through a tiny gap, sending a thin blade of cold across your face. You reach up instinctively and pull your collar higher. The gap will have to wait until daylight, if daylight comes quietly enough to allow repairs. A sudden, cracking sound echoes through the storm. Your body stills instantly. You listen, every sense alert. The sound comes again, sharper this time. wood breaking under pressure. Your hand drifts toward the corner where your rifle rests, but you do not touch it yet. Panic wastes strength. Strength is life. The sound fades, swallowed by the wind. Likely a branch, overloaded with snow, finally giving way. The mountains are full of such noises, especially during storms like this. Still, your shoulders remain tense long after the sound is gone. Here, vigilance never truly sleeps. You sit back on the edge of the platform, watching the fire settle into a steady burn. The shelter holds, doing what it was built to do. It blocks the wind. It traps heat. It buys time. This place is not a home in the way people imagine. There is no comfort here, no sense of permanence. It is closer to a life support system built from logs, stone, and hard-won knowledge. Every angle, every choice of material, every inch of placement was decided long before the first log was cut. Men who lived this life learned quickly that toughness alone meant nothing. Strength did not stop the wind. Courage did not keep snow from burying a roof. Survival belonged to those who understood the mountains, who listened, who planned, and who built. With winter in mind, outside, the blizzard deepens. The wind no longer howls in waves. It roars constantly now, pressing against the shelter without pause. Snow piles higher along the walls, sealing the structure tighter, even as it threatens to bury it. Somewhere beyond the darkness, valleys fill, ridges vanish, and trails disappear completely. You pull the buffalo robes around your shoulders and sit with your back against the log wall. The wood is cold but solid, reliable. The firelight flickers across the ceiling, and for a moment the world feels very small. Just you, the shelter, the fire. Sleep will come in pieces tonight. It always does when storms like this roll in. You will wake often, checking the fire, listening to the wind, feeling for changes in the air. Each hour past is a quiet victory. Outside, the mountains rage with mercy. Inside, a carefully built shelter stands firm, holding back the cold, holding back the night, one slow-burning log at a time. Morning never truly arrives during storms like this. The darkness only lightens slightly, turning from pitch black to a deep, endless grey. You wake again to the sound of wind dragging itself across the mountains, steady and unrelenting. The fire has held through the night, reduced now to a bed of glowing coals that pulse softly with heat. That alone feels like a quiet miracle. You sit up slowly, listening to the shelter before anything else. The walls creak under the weight of packed snow. The roof holds. The air inside is cold, but it is breathable, survivable. Outside, the storm has erased all sense of time. There is no horizon, no direction, only motion and cold. This is the kind of world where distance becomes dangerous. In the Rocky Mountains during winter, space itself turns hostile. An hour outside is not measured by minutes, but by how long the human body can resist the cold before it begins to fail. Wind strips warmth from skin faster than muscles can produce it. Fingers stiffen first, then toes. Breath becomes shallow, then confused. Judgment fades quietly, without warning, long before strength does. Men who live here understood this truth deeply. They did not speak of bravery when they spoke of winter. They spoke of limits. The storm outside your shelter is not unusual for this time of year. That is what makes it so deadly. The mountains do not need rare disasters to kill. Ordinary winter weather is enough. Snow falls sideways, driven by wind that never seems to rest. Temperatures plunge far below what the human body was ever meant to endure. Even movement becomes dangerous. As sweat freezes against skin and clothing stiffens like armor, you imagine stepping outside now. The door would open only a few inches before snow pressed back, eager to fill the space. The wind would strike your face instantly, sharp and punishing. In seconds, your eyelashes would crust with ice. In minutes, exposed skin would go numb, then burn, then lose all feeling entirely. Breathing would hurt. Thinking would slow. An hour would be generous. Stories passed quietly. Among mountain men, shared by firelight and never exaggerated. Men who stepped outside to check traps and never returned. Men who wandered only a short distance from camp, lost their bearing in blowing snow, and walked in circles until their strength gave out. Men who thought they could outrun a storm and learned too late that the mountains always move fast. Inside your shelter, you pull the ropes tighter and add another small piece of wood to the fire. The flame responds quickly, eager for fuel. Fire is the only thing standing between you and the outside world. Without it, the cold would creep inward, filling the shelter inch by inch until it matched the storm beyond the walls. You have learned to respect how fast that can happen. The air outside does not simply chill the body. It steals heat aggressively, especially when paired with wind. A calm, cold night can be survived with the right clothing and movement. Add wind and survival time collapses. Heat is torn away faster than it can be replaced. The body begins to shut down quietly, efficiently, without drama. That is why mountain men feared wind more than snow. Snow could be managed. It could be shoveled, packed, even used as insulation. Wind was different. Wind found every weakness. It slipped through seams, crept under doors, and pulled warmth straight from burn. A shelter built without wind in mind was a death trap, no matter how thick its walls were. You glance toward the low doorway of the shelter. It is built deliberately small, forcing anyone who enters or exits to crouch. Less open space means less heat loss. Even now, with the door sealed and snow packed from the outside, you can feel faint currents of air shifting when the wind surges particularly hard. The mountains are teaching, always teaching. For men who lived here year-round, winter reshaped every habit. Distance was calculated carefully. Tasks were planned in advance. Firewood was stacked close enough to reach without long exposure. Water sources were chosen for reliability, not convenience. Mistakes were not corrected later. They were paid for immediately. Even clothing carried weight and consequence. Layers were chosen not for comfort, but for how they trapped air. Wool stayed warm when wet. Animal hides blocked wind. Leather stiffened in extreme cold, but protected skin beneath. Nothing was worn by accident. You imagine the countless decisions made before the shelter ever stood here. Where to build, how high to raise the floor, which direction to face the doorway, how thick to make the walls. Every choice was shaped by the knowledge that one bad hour could end everything. Outside, the storm shifts slightly, the wind changing pitch as it wraps around the terrain. Somewhere beyond the walls, snow piles into drifts tall enough to bury a man standing upright. Trails vanish. Landmarks disappear. The world becomes uniform and disorienting. In such conditions, even experienced men could lose themselves. Inside the shelter, time moves differently. You measure it by the fire, by hunger, by the slow ache of muscles resting too long in the cold. You eat sparingly, knowing that supplies must last. You drink melted snow warmed just enough to take the edge off. Every action is deliberate, conserving strength. The fire crackles softly, a steady presence against the storm's roar. It reminds you that survival here is not about fighting the mountains. It is about cooperating with them, giving them what they demand, respecting the limits they enforce. You settle back against the wall, eyes half closed, listening. Outside, an hour passes, then another. The storm continues, indifferent to your shelter, indifferent to your existence. It does not rage louder out of anger nor soften out of mercy. It simply is, and that is what makes it dangerous. There is no warning, no negotiation, no second chance offered. Inside, warmth holds, barely, but enough in this world, where 1 hour outside could mean death, survival, belongs to those who understand that staying alive is not about speed or strength. It is about patience, preparation, and knowing exactly when not to step beyond the door. Long before winter closed its grip around the mountain, before snow sealed trails and silence settled into the valleys, a decision had already been made. Becoming a mountain man did not begin in the wilderness. It began far away, in places where life felt narrow and predictable, where work followed clocks instead of seasons, and where opportunity felt just out of reach. For many, the idea of the mountains arrived as a whisper. Stories traveled along rivers and roads, carried by traders, sailors, and returning trappers. Tales of deep valleys filled with beaver, of clear streams cutting through untouched land, of freedom measured not in comfort, but in distance from authority. The Rocky Mountains became more than a place. They became a promise. That promise came with conditions. Between the early 1820s and the middle of the century. Thousands of men pushed westward into terrain that maps barely understood. They came from many places. French-Canadian voyagers who already knew rivers and cold. American frontiersmen raised on the edge of settlement. European immigrants who had crossed oceans and now looked toward mountains as their final gamble. What they shared was not fearlessness, but a willingness to trade safety for possibility. The wilderness greeted them without ceremony. There were no signs marking borders, no paths worn smooth by generations of travelers. Forests stretched endlessly. Rivers cut through valleys with no bridges and no forgiveness. Summer offered brief generosity, but even then the mountains watched patiently, waiting for the season to turn learning. To live here required unlearning nearly everything else. A mountain man could not rely on stores or schedules. Supplies were carried on backs or packed onto animals, and once they were gone, they were gone. Food came from traps, from hunting, from careful rationing. Tools were few and precious. An axe, a knife, a rifle. Each one served multiple purposes and demanded constant care. Winter was always the measure. Men who arrived in the mountains during warmer months often mistook survival for success. They built quickly, traveled freely, and underestimated what waited for them. The first true winter corrected those assumptions without hesitation. Snow fell earlier than expected. Rivers froze thick and fast. Game moved or disappeared. Cold settled into bones and refused to leave those who survived their first winter were no longer newcomers. Becoming a mountain man was not about appearance or reputation. It was about adaptation. Learning how to read weather not from forecasts, but from the behavior of clouds and wind. Understanding how terrain shaped storms, how valleys collected cold air, how ridges amplified wind. Knowing when to move and when to stay still. Mistakes were instructors here. A poorly chosen campsite meant sleepless nights and dangerous exposure. A rushed shelter meant waking to snow drifting across your face. Wet clothing meant frozen clothing, and frozen clothing meant immobility. Each lesson was immediate and unforgiving. Over time, habits formed. Fire became central to every plan, not just building it, but feeding it properly, protecting it from wind, and ensuring fuel was always within reach. Firewood was cut and stacked long before winter arrived, chosen for how it burned and how long it lasted. Green wood was avoided. Damp wood was dried. Nothing was wasted. Shelter construction evolved with experience. Early attempts were crude and inefficient. Walls too thin, roofs too flat, entrances too wide. Winter exposed every weakness. Men learned to build lower, tighter, closer to the ground. They learned to face entrances away from prevailing winds. They learned to use earth, snow, and natural features as allies rather than obstacles. Clothing changed as well. Fabric meant little without understanding. Cotton killed, wool saved, animal hides blocked. Wind better than woven cloth ever could. Layers trapped air, and trapped air meant warmth. Everything worn had purpose. Nothing was decorative. Isolation shaped the mind. Days passed without conversation. Storms trapped men inside shelters for weeks at a time. Silence pressed in, broken only by wind, fire, and the occasional crack of shifting wood. Loneliness was not dramatic here. It was steady, quiet, and constant. Those who endured learned to find rhythm. Simple routines grounded the day. Tending the fire, checking traps when weather allowed, repairing tools, drying clothing. Small actions repeated carefully created a sense of order in a world that offered none. The wilderness did not care who you were before. Titles, past successes, and former failures meant nothing beyond the mountains. A man was measured only by what he could do now. Could he build shelter that held? Could he read the land accurately? Could he remain calm when storms erased the world beyond arm's reach? Many could not. Some turned back before winter deepened, carrying stories instead of pelts. Others pressed on and vanished, absorbed quietly into the landscape. The mountains kept their lessons visible for those who knew how to look. A collapsed shelter, a scattered campsite, tools left where a hand dropped them. Those who remained became something different. They moved more slowly. They spoke less. They watched more. Their decisions were shaped by seasons rather than urgency. Survival sharpened perception. On. Every sound mattered. Every change in wind meant something by the time winter arrived in full force. Those who had adapted no longer questioned their place. They belonged not because the mountains welcomed them, but because they understood them well enough to coexist. Inside a shelter, listening to the storm, a mountain man did not curse the cold. He expected it. He prepared for it. He respected it. The frozen wilderness was not an enemy to be conquered, but a force to be endured through knowledge and restraint. Become a mountain man meant accepting that comfort was temporary. Safety was earned daily, and survival was never guaranteed. It meant understanding that freedom came with weight, and that every choice carried consequences measured in warmth, strength, and time outside. Winter continued its quiet work, reshaping the land without pause. Inside, a man shaped by cold, silence, and experience sat steady, knowing that in this frozen wilderness, survival was not about escaping the storm, but learning how to live within it. The storm does not care how long you have been here. It does not care how carefully you built your shelter or how well you planned your supplies. It only moves forward, hour after hour, pressing its weight against the mountains. Inside the shelter, you feel that truth settle in slowly, like the cold finding its way through layers of wood and earth. Out here, there is no one coming. That understanding changes everything. There are no distant lights beyond the trees, no roads buried beneath the snow, no signal fires waiting to be seen. Once winter closes in, the mountains become a sealed world, and everyone inside it is on their own. Help is not delayed. It does not exist. Men who came west learned this quickly, sometimes too quickly. In settled places, mistakes could be softened. A neighbor might lend food. A doctor might arrive. A warm building might be just a short walk away. In the high country, none of that applied. Distance was measured not in miles, but in survival time. You glanced toward the shelter door, now rimmed with ice and packed snow. Opening it would mean letting the storm inside, even briefly. Closing it again would never fully undo the damage. Heat lost could not be replaced easily. Cold invited more cold. Every choice had weight. Mountain men spoke rarely about fear, but they respected consequence. They knew that a single bad decision could not be corrected later. If you built too close to a river and it flooded under ice, there was no higher ground to flee to in a blizzard. If you ran out of firewood in January, There was no spare supply waiting somewhere else. There was only what you had already prepared. That reality shaped behavior in quiet ways. Tasks were never rushed. Tools were checked twice. Shelter repairs were done early, before storms made them impossible. Firewood was stacked carefully, close enough to reach in bad weather but far enough from the fire to stay dry. You shift closer to the hearth and extend your hands toward the flames, careful not to waste heat. The fire responds gently, steady and predictable. It is the closest thing to reliability in this place. Stories circulate among men who share winters like this. Not stories meant to frighten, but reminders. A trapper who pushed too far from camp to check one last line before dark. A man who trusted clear skies too much and was overtaken by wind before he could return. Another who misjudged a roof's strength and never woke after heavy snowfall. None of them were foolish. They simply ran out of margin. That is what makes this world so unforgiving. There is no room for error large enough to notice in advance. Mistakes do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves only when it is too late to fix them. Inside the shelter, the walls seem closer than usual. The storm's pressure is constant now, a low, steady force. Snow insulates even as it threatens, packing itself into every corner and hollow. The roof creaks occasionally, reminding you that even well-built things have limits. You stand and move slowly around the interior, checking what you can. The firewood stack is smaller than it was yesterday. Not dangerously so, but enough to notice. Supplies always look thinner in winter. When days stretch and storms linger, food is measured carefully. Hunger is tolerated. Eating too much too soon invites trouble later. Melted snow fills a small container near the fire, steam rising faintly. Water must never be tea. Taken for granted. Dehydration weakens the body faster than cold alone. The absence of rescue makes the mind sharper. Every sound outside becomes information. The wind's pitch tells you how it moves around the terrain. The way snow piles against one wall more than another reveals how well the shelter is positioned. Even silence carries meaning. A sudden quiet can signal a shift in weather just as clearly as rising noise. You sit back, down, wrapped in hides, and listen. Somewhere beneath the storm, the mountains are still, ancient, indifferent. They have seen men come and go long before this winter, and will continue long after. That knowledge does not bring comfort, but it brings clarity. There is no negotiation here. Survival is not heroic. It is methodical. It is the accumulation of small, correct decisions made consistently over time. It is knowing when to act and when to wait, when to conserve and when to spend effort. Mountain men understood that waiting could be as dangerous as moving. Too much caution could lead to starvation. Too much confidence could lead to exposure. Balance was learned slowly, often painfully. You think of the men who did not make it, not with judgment, but with recognition. They faced the same storms, the same choices. Some learned faster, some learned slower. Some never had the chance to learn at all. The fire pops softly, sending a brief shower of sparks upward before settling again. You are just a log, nudging it just enough to keep the flame even. The movement feels familiar now, almost automatic, outside. Time continues its quiet march. Hours pass without ceremony. The storm does not lessen. It does not intensify dramatically either. It simply remains, testing endurance rather than courage. This is how winters here kill most effectively, not through sudden violence, but through persistence. Inside, the shelter holds. It holds because it was built with this exact reality in mind. No rescue, no second choice. Only preparation, knowledge, and respect for the environment that surrounds it. You close your eyes briefly, not to sleep fully, but to rest. To let muscles relax without surrendering awareness. This is how nights pass during deep winter, in fragments, In careful pauses, when you open them again, the fire is still there. The walls still stand. The storm still rages. And for now, that is enough. The wind presses in waves now, not striking once and moving on, but leaning against the shelter as if it intends to stay. Snow builds quietly along the walls, packing itself into every uneven place, sealing cracks while adding weight. Inside, the air feels thicker, warmer than it should be, held in place by wood, earth, and careful design. Shelter is not comfort here. It is permission to keep breathing. Without these walls, the fire would be meaningless. Without the roof, the robes would fail. Out there, strength fades quickly, but inside, time stretches, minutes become hours, hours become nights. Shelter does not defeat the mountain. It slows it down enough for a man to endure. You shift your position on the raised platform, feeling the solid resistance of logs beneath you. The ground below is frozen hard, a reservoir of cold that never sleeps. The small distance between your body and that earth matters more than most people would ever understand. Cold rises patiently, and anything resting directly on the ground eventually becomes part of it. This platform is not an afterthought. It is one of the first things built. Men who learned the hard way understood that the earth steals heat faster than air. Sleeping even a few inches above it could mean the difference between waking stiff and waking weak. Add layers of hide, trap air between them, and suddenly the night becomes survivable. You glance around the shelter again, seeing it not as a room but as a system. The walls are thick, not just for strength, but for insulation. Logs stacked tightly slow the movement of air. Mud and moss pressed into the seams block wind that would otherwise cut straight through. Even imperfections have purpose, catching snow that later freezes and adds another layer of protection. The roof slopes low and steep, encouraging snow to slide or settle evenly instead of piling dangerously in one place. Too flat, and it would collapse. Too steep, and heat would escape too easily. The balance is subtle, learned through winters that punished poor judgment. The doorway is small, barely wide enough to pass through without turning sideways. It forces you to bow slightly every time you enter or leave. Less space means less heat loss. It also reminds you quietly that the shelter is in control here, not you. Fire sits at the center of everything, not just its warmth, but its predictability. Fire dries clothing hung nearby. It melts snow for water. It keeps tools from freezing solid. It brings light that holds back the mental weight of darkness. Without fire, shelter becomes a trap rather than a refuge. You watch the flames lick along the edge of a log, steady and calm. Too much fire would be wasteful, burning fuel faster than necessary. Too little would invite cold inward. Managing it is a constant task, one that never truly ends. This is why shelter meant everything. Out here, there is no separating daily life from survival. There is no safe margin where mistakes can be absorbed. The shelter is the boundary. Inside it you live. Outside it you endure or you don't. Mountain men learned early that the best trap lines, the best rifles, the strongest bodies meant nothing if the shelter failed. Winters did not kill men while they worked. They killed them while they slept, while they rested, while they assumed safety. Where there was none, a poorly placed shelter became a wind tunnel. A poorly built one became a freezer. A poorly maintained one slowly betrayed its occupant, draft by draft, leak by leak, until warmth slipped away unnoticed. You pull a robe tighter around your shoulders and lean back against tea. Wall. The wood is cold, but not biting. It holds the night at bay, doing its quiet work. The sound of the storm dulls slightly, muted by layers of timber and snow. Silence inside a shelter like this is never complete. There is always the crackle of fire, the soft creak of wood adjusting, the distant voice of wind filtered through walls. Those sounds become familiar, even reassuring. Sudden silence, on the other hand, feels wrong. Dangerous shelter shapes the mind as much as the body. In storms that last days or weeks, a man's world shrinks to the space inside these walls, the same shadows, the same tools, the same routines repeated carefully. Without shelter, the mind frays quickly, overwhelmed by cold wind and exposure. Inside, thought slows. Order returns. You think of the first winters men faced before this knowledge was refined. Crude, lean toss that collapsed under snow. Cabins built in open valleys where wind tore straight through. Shelters placed too close to rivers that froze, flooded, and destroyed everything, though winters taught lessons written into later designs. The mountains did not teach gently, but they taught thoroughly. Shelter also meant permanence, even if temporary. It allowed a man to stay long enough to learn the land, to observe animal movement, to understand weather patterns. Without shelter, every day was a retreat, a constant scramble away from cold rather than a measured engagement with it. Inside this structure, you are not strong. You are not brave. You are simply prepared. That preparation allows you to wait out the storm instead of racing against it. It allows you to conserve strength rather than spend it fighting wind and snow. It allows you to wake tomorrow. If tomorrow comes quietly enough, you adjust the fire once more, feeling the warmth return to your hands. The shelter responds, holding the heat, refusing to give it back to the night too quickly. Outside, snow continues to fall, layer upon layer, reshaping the world. Inside, nothing changes much, and that is exactly the point. In a place where one wrong hour could end everything, shelter was not an accessory to survival. It was survival itself. Every other skill depended on it. Every other decision revolved around it. You settle back, breathing slow, even listening to the storm press against walls, built for this exact moment. The shelter does not promise safety forever. It promises something smaller, something more realistic. It promises another night, and in these mountains, that is everything. Before the first log was ever cut, before the axe rang against frozen wood, the most important work was already underway. It happened quietly, with long pauses and careful watching. Choosing where to build was not a matter of convenience or comfort. It was a matter of survival. The land decided first. The man only learned how to listen. You imagine standing outside before winter truly arrived. The air sharp but manageable, the ground still visible beneath pack. Hairs of early snow, the mountains rise around you vast and indifferent. Every direction looks possible. Every direction is dangerous in its own way. A shelter built in the wrong place would fail no matter how well it was constructed. Mountain men learned this lesson quickly, sometimes in a single season. A spot that felt calm on a clear day could become a wind tunnel once storms rolled in. A peaceful hollow could turn into a frozen bowl where cold air settled and never left. A slope that seemed stable could release tons of snow without warning, so they walked. They watched. They waited. Wind was the first enemy considered. Not the strongest gusts, but the steady direction storms followed year after year. In these mountains, winter winds often came from the northwest, cutting across ridges and funneled through gaps with brutal efficiency. A shelter placed in their path would bleed heat endlessly. The safest location, hid from the wind rather than challenged it. South-facing slopes were prized. They caught what little sunlight winter offered, allowing the shelter to warm slightly during the day. Even a few degrees mattered. Behind rock outcroppings or dense stands of trees, the land itself acted as a shield, breaking wind before it reached the walls. You feel that protection now, hearing how the storm moves around the shelter rather than straight through it. The wind howls, but it does not strike with full force. That was decided long before the storm arrived. Snow came next in. The silent list of dangers. Snow was not just cold, It was weight. It accumulated quietly, pressing down on roofs, filling doorways, burying entire structures if given the chance. Valleys and narrow draws collected drifting snow until nothing beneath could breathe. Experienced men avoided places where snow naturally piled deep. They learned to read drifts, even before winter, by studying how grass bent, how fallen leaves gathered, how the ground shaped the air above it. Avalanches were an ever-present threat in the high country. Certain slopes, especially those between specific angles, held snow until it reached a breaking point. When it released, it did so without warning. No shelter could survive that force. The safest places sat just outside the paths, close enough to resources, but far enough to remain untouched. Water mattered too, but carefully. A nearby stream was valuable for drinking and cooking, but rivers could freeze solid or flood unpredictably under ice. Building too close invited disaster. Building too far meant dangerous travel in winter conditions. The right distance balanced access with safety, allowing water to be gathered quickly and with minimal exposure. Cold air behaved like water in the mountains. It flowed downhill, settling into low places and pooling overnight. Shelters built in valley bottoms often became traps, filled with dense, unmoving cold that never lifted. Higher ground, just enough to escape that pooling, offered warmer nights even when threats. A difference in elevation was slight. You feel that now, sensing how the cold presses against the walls but does not completely overtake the interior. The land beneath the shelter carries part of that burden. Drainage was another quiet concern. Snow melted during brief warm spells, even in winter, and water found every weakness. A shelter built where moisture collected would rot from below or freeze into dangerous ice. Ground that sloped gently away allowed water to escape before it became a problem. All of this was decided without instruments, without measurements, without maps. It was learned by observation, passed between men in conversations that felt casual, but carried life-saving weight. They did not speak of ideal locations. They spoke of places that lasted. A good site did not announce itself. It felt unremarkable, calm, sheltered, almost forgettable. Those were the places that kept men alive. You imagine the moment the decision was made here, the final walk around the area, the pause, the quiet acceptance. This place would do. Not because it was perfect, but because it was the least dangerous option among many. Once chosen, everything else followed. The shelter aligned itself with the land. The doorway faced away from prevailing winds. The walls leaned into natural barriers. The roof angle respected snowfall patterns. The site worked with winter instead of fighting it. Inside, as the storm rages, that choice reveals its value. The wind screams overhead but does not tear at the walls. Snow piles but does not crush. Cold presses in but slows, held back by earth, wood, and smart placement. The shelter feels anchored, as if it belongs where it stands. This is the hidden skill most people never see. Building was important. Fire was essential. But choosing the one place that would not kill you came first. Get that wrong, and nothing else mattered. You sit quietly, listening to the storm pass around rather than through your shelter. The land does its part now, just as it has since the beginning of winter. It absorbs, deflects, and moderates the worst of what the mountains offer. Out there, many places look similar beneath the snow. Inside, you know better. Survival here began long before the storm arrived. It began with standing still, watching the wind, and choosing ground that would allow you to stay alive. Long enough to learn everything else, the mountains speak constantly, even when they seem silent. They speak through wind, through shadow, through the way snow settles and the way trees grow. For those who lived here, learning to read that language was not optional. It was the difference between guessing and knowing. You sit inside the shelter and listen, not just to the storm, but to how it moves. The sound is uneven, louder on one side, softer on the other. That tells you where the wind is being broken, where it is being funneled, where the land is doing its work. This understanding did not come overnight. It came through years of watching, waiting, and surviving. A mountain man did not carry a map the way others did. He carried the landscape in his head, every ridge, every stand of trees, every bend in a river became part of a mental record. Over time, the land revealed patterns. Wind followed the same routes. Snow drifted into the same hollows. Storms arrived from familiar directions and departed just as predictably. Learning to read these patterns began with stillness. Before building, before moving camp, men often spent days simply observing. They watched how clouds wrapped around peaks. They noted which slopes lost snow first and which never seemed to clear. They studied trees bent permanently in one direction, shaped by years of relentless wind. Those trees too. LD stories, a grove leaning slightly downhill hinted at heavy snow loads. Trees stripped bare on one side revealed dominant wind directions. Branches thicker on one face than the other showed where storms struck hardest. Even broken trunks and scattered debris marked paths the wind favored during its worst moments. Snow was another language entirely. Fresh snow revealed tracks, but older snow revealed behavior. Wind-scoured ridges stayed thin and hard, while sheltered areas accumulated deep, soft layers. Drifts formed predictably behind obstacles, growing higher with each storm. A trained eye could see where snow would pile long before winter arrived. These observations guided everything. Shelters were placed where snow would insulate without overwhelming. Paths were chosen where drifts would be manageable. Trap lines were set with knowledge of how animals moved when storms closed in. The ground itself offered clues. Slope angles mattered more than steepness. Certain inclines held snow safely. Others released it violently. Men learned which angles were dangerous and which were stable by watching past slides, by noticing stripped earth, snapped trees, and unnatural clearings carved by moving snow. Cold air, like water, followed gravity. At night, it flowed downhill, pooling in low places. Shelters built too low became cold sinks, regardless of how well they were built. Slightly higher ground stayed warmer, even when exposed to the same weather. This difference could not be felt immediately. It revealed itself slowly. Over long nights and early mornings you feel that advantage now, sensing how the cold presses, but does not settle completely inside the shelter. Water movement mattered even in winter. Streams that flowed beneath ice still shifted the land around them. Ice dams formed, broke, and flooded areas unexpectedly. The safest routes for travel followed ground that stayed consistent, avoiding places where water could rise suddenly under. Snow. A mountain man read the land the way others read signs. A faint depression might signal an old game trail. A line of stones could mark a seasonal stream. A sudden change in tree type hinted at different soil and drainage beneath the surface. Each detail mattered, not alone, but together. This knowledge shaped movement. Travel in winter was planned along ridges that stayed windswept and firm, rather than valleys buried in deep snow. Camps were placed near resources but outside danger zones. Every step was considered with tomorrow in mind. Mistakes revealed themselves quickly. A man who misread the land found himself fighting wind instead of using it. He broke trail through deep drifts, while easier routes lay just out of sight. He built where cold settled instead of passed through. The mountains corrected him without comment. Those who survived learned to slow down and look longer. You think of the countless small decisions that led to this shelter standing here. The choice of this slope, the direction of the doorway, the way the roof meets the wind, none of it was guesswork. It was interpretation inside. As the storm continues, you feel the benefit of that understanding. The shelter sits quietly, not because it is strong, but because it is placed wisely. The land absorbs much of what the weather delivers, reading the mountain. Also meant knowing when not to move. Clear skies could be misleading. A sudden drop in temperature, a shift in wind direction, or a distant haze along the horizon could signal trouble hours away. Men learned to trust these signs over optimism. Better to wait and lose a day than to push forward and lose everything. Patience became a form of skill. It allowed men to stay alive long enough to refine their knowledge. It turned experience into instinct. Over time, reading the land required less conscious thought. It became a quiet awareness, always present, always updating. You sit back against the wall, listening to the storm's tone change slightly. The pitch lowers, the rhythm steadies. That tells you something too. The worst may pass soon, or it may simply settle in for the long haul. Either way, the mountains are speaking, and because someone once learned how to listen, you are here, warm enough, sheltered enough, able to wait. The wind is never just whined here. It carries the weight of mountains, the memory of storms past, and the quiet patience of winter itself. It does not howl merely to scare. It does not bite merely for sensation. It kills, and it oh so faster than the frozen air ever could on its own. Out there, it strips warmth in minutes, leaving numb fingers, burning cheeks, and weakened lungs in its wake. Inside the shelter, you feel the difference immediately. The walls hold the air still, slowing it, breaking it into harmless whispers that circle around rather than rushing straight through. Every crack plugged, every log tightly fitted, every corner pressed with moss or clay, it all matters. Outside, snow moves in chaotic swirls, but inside, it is distant, muted and slow. The fire fights alongside you, but it cannot do the job alone. Shelter and wind deflection together are what makes survival possible. Choosing where to place the shelter was only the first step. The second was understanding how the wind behaves in this mountain world. Wind is guided by geography. It flows down valleys like water, racing through narrow channels, curling around ridges, finding the smallest gaps and exploiting them. A man standing in its path, even with heavy clothing, feels its cruelty. Instantly, mountain men learn to observe and anticipate. They watched the movement of snow along ridges, the bending of trees, and the patterns of drifting frost. A leaning pine or a sharp crest of rock might seem inconsequential, but it was a hint, a subtle direction on how to hide and how to use nature to resist. A shelter built without considering this invisible force was a trap. Logs would rattle, smoke would be pulled out of the fireplace, and heat would escape, leaving the occupant vulnerable inside. You adjust the doorway flap, noticing how small movements of air create cold drafts. A simple opening, a gap too wide, can become deadly. The door itself is low, forcing a crouch, keeping warmth trapped. Snow packed outside acts as a natural wall, deflecting gusts and buffering the interior. The combination of geography, materials, and design is subtle but decisive. Even once inside, vigilance is constant. A sudden whistle or surge of wind can create tiny pressures, forcing drafts through the smallest cracks. Mountain men learned to reinforce weak points daily. Moss stuffed into seams, extra logs placed strategically, even snow piled against walls during blizzards, all small actions with life-saving impact. They understood that the wind would test them constantly. Every day, every night, you reach toward the fire, letting the warmth flow through your hands. And think about the men who did not survive. They underestimated wind. They built in clearings that seemed safe, in valleys that were easy to reach, only to find themselves exposed to invisible currents that drained life in ways too fast to counter. Exposure does not always arrive slowly. Sometimes it is a snap, a theft of energy, leaving shock and panic before comprehension. The shelter is your shield, but hiding from the wind is as much about awareness as construction. Knowing which side of the hill is safest, which rocks break the gusts, which trees create natural corridors of calm. These are decisions made long before a single storm hits. They require patience, observation, and the humility to understand that the mountains are older, stronger, and more patient than any man inside. Every breath becomes deliberate. You pull the robe tighter across your chest, letting layers trap heat. You avoid quick movements that could push cold air into your core. Even now, you are aware of the temperature difference between corners, noticing how air moves subtly despite walls and roof. In this constant battle, awareness is survival. Outside, the storm rages on, seemingly unrelenting. Snow swirls, wind snaps at trees, and the mountains howl quietly in their own rhythm. But inside, you feel the control that careful placement and meticulous building grant. The wind may rage faster than cold, but here it is slowed, interrupted, and broken. The difference between death and life is in inches, in fractions of a degree, in minutes gained. Being a mountain man means knowing that no shelter is ever perfect, but that every adjustment, every small preparation, every moment of observation matters. You do not fight the wind directly. You hide from it, respect it, and use it to measure where life can exist. The stronger your understanding, the longer you last. The less informed, the sooner winter claims its toll. You sit back, watching the flames dance softly. The wind outside continues its relentless pursuit, but inside the shelter, you are shielded, not invincible, not unconcerned, but alive, because every detail from logs to moss, from roof angle to doorway height, has been carefully executed. The wind may still be the deadliest force in these mountains, faster than cold in its attack, but here it has met a boundary it cannot breach. And for tonight, that boundary holds. The mountains are rarely violent in obvious ways. They do not roar or strike suddenly like a predator. Instead, their deadliest threats are patient, silent, and invisible until it is too late. Snow accumulates, ice forms, and slopes wait quietly for the weight to become unbearable. These are the silent killers, subtle, unrelenting, and indiscriminate. You sit inside your shelter, fire crackling softly, listening to the storm outside. Each flake that lands is part of a larger system you cannot see from within. Outside, snow piles steadily, building layers that conceal danger beneath a soft, inviting surface. A flat expanse might hide a drift a man could sink into, while a gentle slope might hold the tension of hundreds of tons of snow waiting to move. Avalanches are perhaps the most obvious of these threats, but even then, they arrive silently. Certain slopes, particularly between 25 and 45 degrees, are prone to collapse when snow accumulates past its limit. Trees, rocks, and subtle changes in terrain act as indicators for mountain men. They study these signs, noting stripped slopes or minor slides from previous storms. Every slope has memory. Every angle tells a story. Misreading them can be fatal. Ice is less dramatic, but equally dangerous. Frozen rivers, slick rock faces, and ice-coated trails conceal hazards beneath a deceptively smooth surface. One misstep could lead to a fall, a broken limb, or sliding into hidden crevices. Even frozen ground underfoot can give way when weight and frost combine, creating a trap out of terrain that seemed solid. Snow itself is a silent killer when it presses against structures. Roofs must be angled and reinforced to handle its weight. Too little consideration, and logs can snap. Too much complacency, and snow will seep through seams, chilling the interior and sapping heat. Mountain men knew this well, and constant vigilance during storms was non-negotiable. Every inch of accumulated snow had to be monitored, managed, and anticipated. Inside the shelter, you feel the difference these precautions make. The roof holds firm. Walls do not creak ominously. The floor, raised and insulated, is dry. Every precaution, every choice of location and angle has already shielded you from these silent killers. Without such foresight, the shelter itself could become a death trap. You imagine men who underestimated these threats, those who set camp on slopes that seemed safe, those who ignored subtle ice flows beneath a blanket of snow. Many did not survive their first winter, not from wind or cold alone, but from trusting appearances over careful observation. The mountains do not forgive such errors. Mountain men learn to read these signs as instinctively as they read the wine. Patterns in snow, shifts in ice, and the subtle contour of slopes became a mental map of danger zones. Routes were chosen with this knowledge, shelters were placed with this understanding, and survival became an act of constant awareness. Even now, you feel it, the storm pressing, snow accumulating, ice forming quietly under the drifts. Outside is treacherous, beautiful, and merciless. Inside, you are safe because every detail has been observed, calculated, and respected. Survival here is not about brute strength. It is about patience, vigilance, and respect for forces that operate silently. Snow, ice, and avalanches wait for mistakes. Shelter and knowledge delay them, transforming invisible killers into challenges you can endure, if only for another night. The first step to surviving winter in the mountains was not cutting logs or starting fires, it was claiming solid ground. Foundations were everything. Without a strong, dry base, the rest of the shelter was at the mercy of the mountains. Wet ground could steal heat, rot logs, and invite sickness. A poorly chosen foundation could make survival impossible, even in the best designed shelter. You imagine walking the site before construction begins. Snow drifts are light now. Wind has not yet carved deep hollows, and the earth is frozen but forgiving. Choosing the right patch of land requires careful observation. It must be level enough to support heavy logs, slightly elevated to allow water to run away, and firm enough to resist frost heaving. Every mistake here will be paid for in discomfort or worse. Drainage is the first consideration. Winter is not just snow, it is thaw, meltwater, and ice that seeps through the soil unpredictably. Mountain men knew that water beneath the floor was more deadly than cold winds outside. Standing water could freeze, expand, and lift the shelter from its moorings. Damp bedding meant frostbite. Wet clothing meant immobility. Wet tools meant rust and failure. To prevent this, the floor is cleared of organic debris, twigs, leaves, and moss that retain moisture. The ground is tamped down as tightly as possible, sometimes reinforced with flat stones or packed earth to provide stability. Slight slopes are engineered to guide runoff away from the interior toward natural drainage channels. Every inch of foundation is planned to remain dry, because dryness is life. Logs are not laid randomly. Each one is placed to create stability and resist settling over time. Corner joints are crafted carefully, interlocking in ways that distribute weight evenly. The first layer bears the entire load of the roof and walls above, so precision matters. Even minor misalignment could stress the structure during heavy snow or strong winds. Elevation is subtle but crucial. Floors are raised slightly off the ground, sometimes on short posts or on layers of stone. This prevents moisture from seeping upward and creates a buffer between cold soil and the shelter's interior. Every inch adds protection. Air circulation beneath the floor keeps it dry, extending both comfort and life. Inside the shelter, you feel the difference immediately. The floor is solid underfoot. Wood and hide stay dry. Cold does not seep through the ground as it would in an unprepared location. Even during storms that cover the mountains in snow and ice, the foundation holds. Every step, every movement reinforces stability and safety. This is more than construction, it is anticipation. Mountain men expected heavy snow, ice formation, and occasional flooding from melting snow. They built foundations with these possibilities in mind. Stability was as much about engineering as it was about reading the land. One wrong decision could collapse the roof or ruin the floor, making the shelter no better than a pile of logs. Fire and shelter above would be meaningless if the base could not withstand winter's pressures. Frost heave alone could split logs or tilt the structure. By ensuring a dry, firm foundation, mountain men bought time, space, and control over what otherwise might be a chaotic, deadly environment. Even the choice of materials played a role. Stone, when available, was placed under key supports to resist frost. Earth was compacted and sometimes layered with sand or gravel to improve drainage. Logs were selected for durability, treated with care, and positioned to maximize both stability and insulation. The quiet work of building a foundation demands patience. Each stone set, each layer of earth pressed, each log placed done correctly. It is invisible. You only notice when it is absent, when water seeps up, floors sag, and winter becomes an enemy rather than a challenge. Sitting inside the completed shelter, the fire burning softly, you realize the foundation is more than wood and stone. It is the first and last line of defense against winter. It separates life from the endless cold outside. Every other part of survival relies on it: the fire, insulation, the roof, even your own body. Mountain men built these bases not to impress or beautify. They built them to last through months of storms, through snowdrifts that weighed like boulders, and through relentless winds. They built them to be alive, not alive in the sense of warmth, but alive in function, holding the shelter steady while everything else outside surrendered to winter. Foundations were never glamorous. They were unnoticed until failure made them the center of attention. And yet in the mountains they were sacred, for without a dry, alive foundation, the nights would be endless, the cold unrelenting, and survival would slip away quietly, just like the snow outside. Once the foundation was secure, the next step was raising the walls. But these were not ordinary walls. They were the product of careful observation, years of trial and error, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned the mountains could be unforgiving. Each log told a story, each placement carried purpose, and each gap was a potential threat if ignored. Logs were carefully selected for strength and durability. Straight, sturdy trunks from nearby forests were prized, while knots or cracks could compromise the integrity of the shelter. Mountain men knew which species resisted rot, which held warmth best, and which could bear heavy snow without splitting. But material alone was not enough. The way logs were stacked, interlocked, and sealed required skill. This skill came only from experience, often learned the hard way. Corners were critical, not just for structure but for stability against wind. Logs were interlocked in a method known as saddle notching, allowing the walls to fit together tightly, distributing weight evenly. A poorly notched corner meant gaps, drafts, and in winter death. Every cut had to be precise. Too loose, and cold would enter. Too tight, and the wood could split under pressure. Between logs, chinking was essential. Moss, clay, and mud were pressed into seams to seal gaps. This simple combination kept wind from rushing through and heat from escaping. It was a subtle process. Too little chinking and drafts crept in, too much and the logs could not settle naturally as they shifted during freeze and thaw cycles. Experience dictated the exact balance. The walls were more than protection. They were insulation. Each log absorbed some cold, each layer slowed the passage of air. Combined with the fire inside and the raised floor below, the walls created a microclimate that made survival possible. Outside, the storm might howl and snow might pile high, but inside, warmth persisted. Height mattered as well. Too low, and snow could easily pile against the roofline, increasing pressure on the structure. Too high, and heat would escape, and logs would be harder to stack safely. Mountain men found the balance between these extremes, ensuring that walls were tall enough to offer headroom but compact enough to preserve heat. Building the wall, Ellis was also a lesson in patience. Each log had to be lifted, aligned, and secured. Work could not be rushed, especially in cold conditions where hands numbed and wood became slippery. Men learned to move deliberately, testing each piece, listening to the sound it made as it settled. A wall that felt solid today might shift tomorrow if care was lacking. Experience also guided placement relative to the elements. Openings for doors and windows were minimal, positioned away from prevailing winds. Any window was small, serving only for light and ventilation, never for comfort. Every gap in the wall was calculated. Every design choice was informed by the memory of past storms, of shelters that failed and men who did not survive. You sit inside now, noticing the thickness of the walls, the way they feel solid beneath your touch. They do not tremble in the wind. They do not leak drafts. Their stability is not accidental. It is earned. Every notch, every layer of chinking, every log's position is the result of countless winters lived, studied, and endured. The walls also carried a psychological weight. Standing within them, a man felt sheltered, protected, and prepared. Confidence came from knowing that the structure could hold against what the mountains would throw at it. Yet this confidence was tempered with respect. Walls could be breached if not maintained, or if the storm was especially violent. Constant vigilance was still required. Even inside, the walls spoke of lessons learned. They reminded men that survival depended as much on intelligence and patience as on strength or courage. A strong man without knowledge could die outside, while a weaker man with wisdom could last through storms that seemed endless. Logs, knowledge, and experience combined to form more than walls. They formed a sanctuary. Each layer preserved heat, resisted wind, and created a steady rhythm in a world of chaos. They were the embodiment of all the mountain man had learned about the land, the weather, and the quiet discipline required to endure winter without rescue, without second chances. The storm presses on outside, relentless, but the walls remain firm. You feel the separation between the violence outside and the calm within. Every crack has been addressed, every gap sealed, every log placed with intention. The walls are alive with experience, a silent testament to the wisdom of those who came before. In these mountains, walls built this way are more than shelter, they are survival itself. They hold life in place while the winter rages beyond. And they are a reminder that knowledge and experience are as critical as any physical tool in the struggle to endure, in the shelter. The fire is not just warmth. It is the center of survival, the heartbeat of the structure, and the line between living and succumbing to the mountain winter. Outside, temperatures can drop far below freezing. Winds whip like knives, and snow accumulates relentlessly. Inside, the fireplace dictates eve, or a measure of comfort, every moment of safety, every breath taken without risk. It is, in essence, life and death concentrated in stone and flame. Building a fireplace in a mountain shelter was far from simple. It required careful planning, precise construction, and an intimate understanding of fire behavior in extreme conditions. The stone had to be chosen for heat retention, durability, and safety. Flat, dense rock was prized. capable of withstanding repeated heating without cracking. The hearth had to be positioned to maximize warmth throughout the shelter, while minimizing the risk of sparks reaching hides or wood. One misstep could ignite a catastrophe. Fuel placement was equally critical. Mountain men never wasted wood. Firewood had to be dry, properly stacked, and accessible even in blizzards. Every log was measured for burn time and heat output. Too little fire, and the shelter could quickly reach deadly temperatures. Too much, and precious fuel would vanish before the storm ended. Fire management was a science, as much as it was an art. The fireplace was also central to controlling airflow. The smoke needed to exit efficiently without siphoning heat away from the interior. The flue had to be angled just right, the opening sized correctly, and the stones carefully arranged to radiate heat back into the room. A poorly constructed fireplace could choke the shelter with smoke or drain warmth faster than the body could generate it. You sit near the fire now, feeling the radiati, any heat against your hands, the scent of burning wood filling the small space. Each flicker of flame reminds you of how tenuous life is out there, beyond the walls. One careless moment outside could mean exposure, but here the fire gives the mountain man control. Its flames dictate sleep schedules, cooking routines, and even how long a man can remain in one spot without moving. Fire was also a tool of observation. Its glow illuminated corners where drafts might creep through, revealing leaks in chinking or gaps in logs. Adjustments could be made in real time, adding moss, pressing clay, or stacking an extra log to redirect airflow. Mountain men treated their fireplaces as living systems, constantly monitored, constantly fine-tuned, beyond heat. The fireplace provided essential functionality. It melted snow for water, warmed clothing and bedding, and kept tools from freezing solid. Even cooking depended on its precise operation. Without it, sustenance became impossible. Every small task in the shelter revolved around its efficiency. The fire also carried psychological power. Flames offered comfort in a world dominated by harsh silence and cold. Watching the fire dance was meditative, a way to measure time and maintain alertness without succumbing to panic. In the mountains, mental endurance was as important as physical. The fireplace anchored both, but fire is fragile. A sudden draft, wet fuel, or inattentive tending could snuff it out, and with it the shelter's protective RMT. A dead fire at night in January could end life quietly, slowly, without drama, leaving the occupant to succumb to cold and darkness. Mountain men understood this implicitly. Fire dies, you die. They would often say, and it was not exaggeration. You glance at the stack beside the hearth. Every piece of wood has been carefully measured, split, and arranged for optimal use. The smallest miscalculation in burn rate could mean running out before the storm ends. Every log added, every spark preserved, is a step away from death and a step closer to dawn. The fireplace, then, was more than a tool. It was a survival system, a carefully managed microclimate within the shelter. Its design, placement, and maintenance reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge. Mountain men learned to respect it as they did the mountains themselves. Outside, the blizzard screams, relentless, powerful, and indifferent. Inside, the fire crackles, breathing warmth into the room, holding life in its careful balance. One log at a time, one spark preserved. One flame nurtured the fireplace controls life and death with quiet authority. Sitting back, you watch the flames dance against the walls made of logs, the heat radiating to every corner. In this small, enclosed space, the fire is everything. It is survival in motion, a constant reminder that in the mountains, life is never given, it is earned through preparation, respect, and careful tending to the delicate balance of warmth and wind, wood and stone. And for tonight, as the storm rages outside, it is enough. The fire burns, the shelter stands, and life continues, one controlled flame at a time. The floor beneath you is not just wood or stone, it's a boundary between life and death. The earth, frozen solid, steals warmth faster than any wind, silently drawing heat from every exposed surface. To sleep directly on it in a Rocky Mountain winter is to surrender to the cold, and surrender here is final. The solution was simple in theory but demanding in practice. Sleep above the frozen ground. Mountain men understood that elevation, even by a few inches, created a critical buffer. A raised platform, sometimes built from logs, sometimes reinforced with stones, kept the body from direct contact with the frozen earth. The air trapped beneath acted as insulation, slowing the relentless transfer of cold. Every inch mattered. Even a small misstep in platform height could make the difference between waking stiff, waking weak, or not waking at all. Buffalo hides, furs, and robes were layered on top. They were not luxurious, but they held air and warmth, creating a soft, breathable mattress of survival. Each hide was carefully positioned. Overlapping layers prevented drafts, trapped residual heat from the night before, and provided slight cushioning against the rigid platform beneath. In these layers, heat was conserved, while moisture from breath or sweat was absorbed, preventing a chill that could strike quickly. The placement of the sleeping area within the shelter was also vital. Platforms were usually set near the fireplace, but not so close as to risk sparks or excessive smoke. Heat had to circulate evenly. You could feel warmth creep along the platform, rising slowly to meet the body too far from the hearth, and the cold would reach in too close, and the fire could overheat, drying furs and creating discomfort or danger. Even minor details mattered. Feet were often placed in leather moccasins or wrapped in additional furs. Heads were covered with thick blankets or scarves. Shoulders, often exposed, were carefully adjusted beneath robes. Injuries, old wounds, or joint aches could predict weather severity. A shoulder that throbbed under frostbite-prone air was a warning another layer was necessary. The fire might need tending. The night could be long. Mountain men also slept with vigilance, even in these insulated spaces. Snow pressed against walls. Wind howled through natural gaps. The earth beneath shifted slightly with frost and thaw. A sudden crack, a gust that found its way into the shelter, demanded a quiet awareness. Sleeping was not surrender, it was preparation, rest taken in controlled conditions, with every sense alert to subtle threats. Sleeping above the ground allowed not just warmth, but survival strategy. Being elevated made movement easier if fire needed attention, if a tool was required, if snow needed clearing. Every action in the shelter was deliberate. Elevation of the body was an advantage in a world where lethargy could mean death. Platforms were not always permanent. Some were dismantled and rebuilt each season, adjusted based on accumulated knowledge of wind pat, RNS, snow pressure, and shelter shifts. Logs could warp or settle, stones could shift under weight or frost. Constant care ensured that the sleeping platform remained reliable throughout the long, merciless winter. Beyond physical survival, sleeping above the frozen ground had a psychological impact. The mind understood safety in structure, warmth, and elevation. Even small discomforts could be tolerated if one knew the cold was not seeping directly into bones. Confidence in the platform, in the layers of furs, in the surrounding walls, allowed mental rest without it. Fear alone could sap energy faster than cold. Outside, the storm pressed on, relentless in its pursuit. Snow piled, winds screamed, and temperatures dropped further. Inside, the platform held, furs insulated, the air above the floor still, warm, alive. Sleep became possible, even in this frozen wilderness, being above the ground is more than technique. It is respect for the silent enemy beneath. It is understanding the physics of cold and the patience to build layers that trap warmth, conserve energy, and shield life. It is an early lesson every mountain man learned. The difference between life and death is often measured in inches. You lie back, feeling the weight of blankets, the firmness of logs, the warmth radiating from the hearth nearby. The shelter is a small ecosystem of survival. The ground below remains frozen, indifferent, yet powerless against this carefully constructed buffer. And as you close your eyes, you rest in the quiet knowledge that tonight at least, the frozen earth cannot claim you, the mountains rage inside. You sleep above the frozen ground, alive, warm, and prepared for whatever dawn may bring. Life in the mountains is never passive. Survival is not something that happens by chance. It is earned through constant attention, careful observation, and a steady awareness of the smallest changes in the world around you. Every sound, every shift of wind, every shadow carries meaning. Mountain men lived like this, not because they were paranoid, but because vigilance was survival. Even inside the shelter, the storm never truly stops. Snow piles silently outside, sometimes forming dangerous drifts against the walls. Ice can accumulate in hidden corners, threatening tools or the platform beneath. Wind pushes at seams, testing every notch, every layer of chinking. The fire, too, must be monitored. A log burns too fast or too slow, and the shelter can quickly lose precious heat. Mountain men understood that comfort was fragile, fleeting, and earned through attention. Vigilance extends to sound. A branch snapping in the snow could signal an approaching storm, an avalanche on a distant slope, or even a curious animal. The keen ear of a mountain man could differentiate the hollow echo of falling snow from the dangerous crack of ice shifting beneath weight. Silence, too, was never just silence. It was an opportunity to sense danger before it became immediate food. Water and supplies were another reason for constant attention. Snowstorms could cut off access to resources in hours. Firewood needed replenishing before it ran dangerously low. Water from streams could freeze without warning, forcing careful planning to ensure survival without unnecessary exposure. A misstep could mean hours of exposure in life-threatening conditions. Preparation was inseparable from vigilance. Even small physical signs mattered. Cold fingers, numb toes, or a throbbing shoulder could signal the approach of hypothermia or the worsening of an old injury. Experienced mountain men treated these bodily messages as vital warnings. Ignoring them was a mistake that could quickly become fatal. The body itself became a barometer, silently reporting changes that the mind and experience could interpret. Observation extended beyond immediate survival. Reading the land, watching the patterns of snow and wind, and predicting how conditions might change over hours or days were critical. A sudden shift in wind direction could indicate a storm's arrival. The way snow piled on a ridge might forecast avalanche risk. Even subtle changes in the behavior of wildlife provided clues to upcoming hazards. Vigilance meant being attuned to every aspect of the environment. Sleep, though necessary, was also measured and cautious. A mountain man never fully let down his guard. Even in the raised platform of a warm shelter, one ear remained alert, one hand ready to tend the fire or adjust. The chinking. Sleep was strategic, a brief retreat to restore strength, always balanced again. The need to monitor the outside world. Tools, too, required constant attention. Axes dulled by repeated use could fail at the wrong moment. Knives needed sharpening. Firewood had to be split and stacked efficiently. Neglecting these tasks, even for a moment, could cascade into disaster. The smallest oversight could escalate into life-threatening problems in an environment that allowed no second chances. Vigilance was also mental. The mountains tested resolve, patience, and focus. Complacency could be fatal. Even the most skilled trapper knew that survival depended as much on mental alertness as on physical ability. Maintaining concentration, staying aware of details, and reading signs continuously became second nature. Inside the shelter, these lessons manifest in small rituals. Checking logs for tightness, inspecting chinking for gaps, monitoring the fire, and listening to the storm are repeated throughout the day and night. These acts are not laborious, they are instinctual, a rhythm that separates life from death. Each movement, each glance, each adjustment is purposeful. Outside, the mountains rage. Snow swirls, wind tears across ridges, and avalanches can roar from distant slopes. Inside, the shelter is calm but alive. It is a place where vigilance pays off, where constant attention allows life to continue. Despite the chaos just beyond the walls, living with constant vigilance is not fear, it is respect. Respect for the mountain, for winter, and for the fragile boundary between survival and disaster. It is an awareness that the smallest detail matters, that preparation is never complete, and that the environment will always test the limits of skill and endurance. As night deepens and the fire crackles softly, you feel the rhythm of attention, the quiet alertness that defines existence here. Each sound is noted, each change recorded. You sleep lightly, move carefully, and act deliberately. Every action and inaction is measured, because in these mountains, life is never guaranteed, but vigilance can ensure. It continues, one carefully observed moment at a time. The mountains are patient, but winter is relentless. Storms here do not pass quickly. They linger, day after day, week after week, burying the landscape under layers of snow, whipping wind into every crevice, and testing the endurance of anyone caught unprepared. These storms are not sudden surprises, they are relentless trials. Each hour and each flake adding weight to the already unforgiving. Terrain inside your shelter, the wind screams like a living thing, wrapping around rocks and shaking the walls. Snow drifts against the logs, pressing at the seams as if seeking any weakness. It is impossible to see through the blizzard, impossible to move without effort and risk. Visibility drops to nothing, and the world outside becomes an endless white void. The boundaries between sky and mountain disappear. Peering in the storm's fury, days stretch endlessly. Light becomes a memory. Sun and horizon concealed beneath opaque clouds. Even the strongest fire struggles to keep warmth steady against howling gusts that seek every chink and gap. The heat you generate must be carefully conserved. One miscalculation could drain the fire too quickly, leaving you shivering. In the darkness, while the storm continues outside, rations become vital. Food must be carefully measured. Water, melted from snow, is precious and limited by time and energy required to retrieve it. Movement outside is deadly. Each step risks sinking into snow, slipping on ice, or being battered by wind-driven flakes that sting like needles. Staying alive requires discipline and patience, resisting the urge to leave the shelter. Even when cabin fever strikes, sleep is fragmented. Storms create a rhythm of alertness. The walls groan under snow weight, gusts shake logs, and the fire demands attention. Even in rest, awareness never fully disappears. The mountains teach a lesson here. Complacency is deadly. Every hour is a test, every night a trial. Mountain men adapt to the rhythm of the storm, conserving strength while remaining ready for sudden emergencies. The weight of snow outside is constant. Roofs creak, ice forms along edges, and drifts pile against doors. Each accumulation requires inspection and sometimes intervention. Small failures become catastrophic. Quickly logs can bend, roofs can sag, and exits can be blocked. Shelter is never a finished project. It is a living, breathing system that demands attention. Through the duration of the storm, mental endurance is as critical as physical survival. Weeks of whiteout, isolation, and relentless wind erode patience. Without focus, mistakes happen. Fire neglected, snow cleared too late, gaps ignored. Mountain men survived not because they were stronger, but because they maintained clarity of mind. They measured time not in hours, but in tasks completed, in adjustments made to keep the shelter and themselves intact. The storm also teaches observation. You watch the behavior of snow and ice from inside. Patterns form, gusts that pick up, then settle, drifts that shift predictably, sudden lulls that hint at temporary reprieve. Each observation is a thread of knowledge woven into survival. Ignoring it is fatal. Noticing it allows adaptation and control. Outside, the mountain shapes are hidden, but their dangers are not. Avalanches can be triggered without warning. Ice beneath snow can create deadly traps. Trees can fall under the combined weight of snow and wind. Awareness of these hazards reinforces the importance of the shelter's placement and design. You realize that weeks-long storms are not only a test of endurance, they are a test of all preparation and knowledge. Inside, the fire crackles softly, sending flickers of warmth through the small space. The logs in the walls hold. The floor remains dry, and the platform beneath you elevates you above the frozen ground. Each element of the shelter demonstrates the wisdom of mountain men who understood months of relentless storms and designed for them. They built for survival in extreme patience, knowing that winter does not hurry. The storm outside is unforgiving, but within these walls, life continues. Meals are eaten slowly. Fires are tended with care, and energy is rationed wisely. Sleep is measured, movement is deliberate, and observation is constant. Time loses meaning. Days and nights blend into one continuous challenge, but the shelter stands. The fire burns, and survival persists. Weeks of storm teach humility. The mountains are older, stronger, and more patient than any man. They deliver relentless lessons in endurance and caution. A single night of carelessness can undo weeks of preparation. Survival is the sum of continuous effort, careful observation, and respect for forces beyond control. As the storm rages on, the shelter becomes more than just a structure. It becomes a lifeline, a small kingdom of safety and warmth amidst chaos. Inside, you feel the weight of weeks-long blizzards pressing at every wall, every log, and every corner, but you also feel the quiet power of preparation, experience, and vigilance holding firm. In the mountains, storms may last for weeks without mercy, but with patience, skill, and respect, life endures. Every gust of wind, every flake of snow, every night survived is proof of the mountain man's ability to outlast winter itself. Survival in the mountains was never a gift, it was earned, often at the cost of blood, bones, and lives lost. Every lesson, every technique, every strategy came from experience carved into flesh, learned through mistakes that left scars, and perfected by watching others fail. The mountains are patient teachers, but their lessons are unforgiving. Knowledge here is hard-won. The first trappers ventured into the Rocky Mountains with ambition, skill, and determination, yet little understanding of what lay ahead. Snowdrifts taller than a man, winds that stole breath in seconds, ice that concealed deadly hazards, all were waiting silently. Many underestimated the environment, relying on courage, strength, or luck alone. For some, it was enough to survive a few days. For many others, it was fatal. Every injury carried information. A broken limb from slipping on ice taught caution on frozen surfaces. Frostbitten fingers revealed the importance of insulation and circulation. Hypothermia claimed those who ignored subtle warning signs, shivering. Lethargy or confusion before the body's failure became irreversible. Pain, suffering, and even death were the currency through which men purchased understanding. Observing others was equally critical. The mountains were littered with the remnants of those who had misread slopes, misjudged storms, or mismanaged fire. Experienced trappers learned from these mistakes as much as from their own. A fallen comrade's story, sometimes shared, summoned him. As discovered among the snow was a vivid reminder that every decision mattered. Survival knowledge was passed down like sacred instructions, but always with a caution. Ignore them at your peril. Even shelter building itself was perfected through trial and error. Roofs collapsed under miscalculated snow loads. Walls leaked, floors froze. Fires went out too soon. Every flaw became a lesson etched into the next structure, and every success a tribute to patience and experience. By 1837, veterans like Samuel Mackenzie had survived 17 winters, precisely because they remembered the mistakes of those who had come before. Each scar, each bruise, each frostbitten finger represented a fragment of wisdom. Beyond the physical, there were psychological costs. Isolation, fear, and uncertainty weighed heavily. Mountain men learned to endure mental strain, to remain alert when exhaustion threatened, and to make calm decisions under extreme stress. Mental fortitude was a type of knowledge, one purchased with nights of sleepless vigilance and the constant threat of death. Then the seemingly small details were honed through hardship. How much firewood to stack, how to position furs for maximum insulation, how to measure drift patterns or read terrain were lessons paid for in risk. One oversight could turn a simple task into a deadly gamble. Mountain men developed an almost instinctive understanding of survival that only decades of exposure and hard experience could create. Blood was light, raw as well as symbolic. Injuries sustained during storms, while hunting, or while traveling through treacherous terrain served as immediate feedback. Pain was a teacher. Broken bones were a warning. Each incident reinforced respect for the mountains, humility before winter, and the necessity of preparation. Even nutrition and hydration carried consequences. Eating too little, overexerting, or relying on unsafe water could weaken the body quickly, compounding other dangers. Mountain men learned to ration, to forage, and to manage their resources carefully. Each miscalculation had real costs, reinforcing that survival was not just about bravery. It was about intelligence, patience, and observation. Ultimately, the knowledge mountain men carried was inseparable from the risk they had survived. Skills in fire building, shelter construction, terrain analysis, and storm prediction were not abstract. They were earned with flesh, with bones, with suffering. Every log notched correctly, every hearth carefully maintained, every slope read properly was proof that lessons had been paid for some time. Dearly, sitting in the shelter, feeling the fire's warmth and the solid walls around you, it becomes clear how precious this knowledge is. It is not something you find in books or learn overnight. It is a living inheritance passed from veteran to newcomer, constantly refined through lived experience, pain, and observation. The mountains demand respect, and knowledge is their currency spent, and lie through endurance and sacrifice. Outside, the blizzard rages, relentless and indifferent. Inside, you feel the weight of generations' hard-earned wisdom. Every layer of logs, every careful hearth, every elevated platform and insulated sleeping spot is built upon lessons learned through blood and bones. Survival is not guaranteed, but with knowledge earned and respected, you have the tools to endure what the mountain throws at you. In the mountains, life and death are separated by understanding, preparation, and vigilance. Blood and bones are the price, but the lessons they teach are priceless, and they are what allow a man to face the relentless winter and live to see another dawn in the Rocky Mountains. Winter is not just a season, it is a relentless force that shapes every decision, every action, and every thought. Survival is rarely about brute strength. It is about systems, structures, and meticulous preparation. For a mountain man, the shelter was more than a cabin or a refuge. It was a life support machine, engineered to protect, sustain, and regulate existence against forces that would otherwise claim it immediately. You wake to the muffled roar of wind outside, snow pressing against the walls. Every inch of the shelter has been crafted to resist the storm. The raised platform keeps your body insulated from the frozen ground. Walls of interlocked logs, carefully notched and chinked with moss and clay, hold heat and block gusts. Even small gaps have been sealed because, say, in the mountains, a single draft can threaten life. This is not construction, it is a system designed for survival. The fireplace dominates the shelter, both literally and figuratively. Its fire radiates warmth, dries furs, and melts snow for water. It controls the internal climate, prevents hypothermia, and dictates every action. The way logs are stacked, the order in which they burn, and the management of coals are all part of maintaining this life support. One misstep fire too low, fuel mismanaged, could be fatal. The fireplace is the engine of the system, tirelessly sustaining life in a world that offers no mercy. Every element of the shelter functions together. Elevated sleeping platforms preserve heat and prevent cold from seeping through the ground. Layers of hides and furs trap residual warmth and create comfort against the rigid logs. Walls are thick, insulating, and alive with the accumulated knowledge of decades of mountain survival. Together with the fire, these components regulate temperature, airflow, and moisture, the basic elements of human survival in extreme winter. Water, food, and tools are integrated into this life support network. Snow is gathered outside and carefully melted over the hearth for drinking and cooking. Food is rationed, cooked, and stored to minimize exposure to the elements. Tools are kept dry and ready, each one a critical part of maintaining the shelter and its systems. Neglecting any of these components could disrupt the delicate balance, and the consequences could be immediate. Even sound and motion within the shelter are part of the system. Listening for shifting snow, groaning logs, or wind slipping through tiny gaps is as crucial as tending the fire. Movement is deliberate, adding logs to the hearth, adjusting furs, checking structural integrity. Each action sustains the microclimate, ensures stability, and preserves life. The shelter requires attention, respect, and constant management. It is not passive. The design of the shelter reflects an intimate understanding of the environment. Placement behind natural windbreaks, selection of terrain with proper drainage, southern exposure for maximum sun, and strategic elevation all contribute to its effectiveness. A mountain man learned over time to integrate these factors, transforming wood, stone, and hides into a living system that supports life against forces that would otherwise overwhelm it, even in extreme storms that last weeks. The shelter continues to function as a life support machine. Snow accumulates, ice forms, and wind presses against walls. Yet the interior remains habitable. Heat is preserved, water is accessible, and the mountain man is insulated from the lethal conditions outside. Every component works in harmony, creating a controlled environment where survival is possible. Psychologically, the shelter is equally vital. It provides stability, confidence, and a sense of order amidst chaos. Knowing that the platform is secure, the walls so. lid and the fire maintained allows the mind to rest briefly without surrendering awareness. Mental endurance is reinforced by the shelter's reliability, giving the mountain man strength to continue. Even in the longest, harshest storms, the shelter as a life support machine is also adaptable. Mountain men constantly monitor and adjust its elements, clearing snow from roofs, adjusting fire intensity, rearranging furs and hides, checking drainage, and repairing chinking. The system is dynamic, responding to changing conditions, and it requires continuous attention. It is not static, because the mountains themselves are not static, sitting inside, the fire crackling, walls warm, platform raised, and furs layered carefully. You realize the shelter is more than wood and stone. It is a controlled environment. It preserves heat, protects from wind, manages moisture, supplies water, and offers rest. It is survival distilled into a tangible, functioning system. Life here is maintained not by luck, but by design, knowledge, and constant care. Outside, blizzards rage, ice forms, and the mountains remain indifferent. Inside, the shelter hums with quiet efficiency. It is a life support machine in the truest sense, preserving warmth, preventing exposure, and sustaining a fragile human presence in a world that offers nothing without preparation. Every element fire, walls, floor, platform, furs, and vigilance works together in perfect harmony. In the end, surviving the mountains is not about fighting winter. It is about creating systems to live with it. The shelter, meticulously designed, constantly managed, and lived with, is the ultimate testament to human ingenuity and resilience. Here, in the heart of a frozen wilderness, the life support machine is the difference between endurance and oblivion, between warmth and cold, between life and death. The final test of the mountain's cruelty is endurance. Winter here is not brief. It is long, punishing, and relentless. Many who ventured into the Rockies for fortune, freedom, or adventure did not survive the season. Storms lasted for weeks. Snow buried the landscape, and winds carved across ridges with a force that could strip life from the unprepared. Survival is not measured in hours, but in patience, knowledge, and the quiet refusal to surrender. By this point, a mountain man understands the rhythm of the cold. Days blend into nights, yet each is punctuated by routine, tending the fire, checking the walls, measuring snowdrifts, rationing food, and listening to the world outside. Each task seems small in isolation, but together they form a lifeline. Missing one, overlooking a weak spot in a wall, letting fire die too low, or miscalculating food could be fatal. Survival is cumulative. The storms outside are unyielding, and yet inside, the shelter hums with stability. Elevated platforms, thick walls, furs, and careful fire management have kept the bitter cold at bay. Platforms and sleeping areas have preserved warmth. Above the frozen earth, walls built from logs notched with precision block the wind. Fires maintained with meticulous care radiate life into every corner. Everything the mountain man has done converges into one truth. Preparation saves life. Physical endurance is tested daily. Fatigue and cold sap strength slowly, invisibly. Even a minor injury can become dangerous. Hands stiffen, joints ache, and muscles cramp. Every movement must be calculated to conserve energy. Nutrition is critical. Every morsel eaten and every sip of water consumed has been measured to sustain function. Mountain men understand the fragility of their bodies, and they treat them as precious tools to be preserved. Yet survival is not merely physical. The mind is under constant strain. Isolation stretches hours into days, and days into weeks. Storms obscure the sun, and the horizon disappears beneath a white veil. Mental endurance becomes as critical as bodily strength. Mountain men maintain routines, rituals, and tasks to preserve focus. They measure time in chores completed, in logs added to the fire, in snow shoveled from entrances, rather than in hours or days. The lessons of earlier winters, the scars earned through blood and bone, and the meticulous construction of the shelter now bear fruit. Every notch in the logs, every layer of moss and clay in the chinking, every carefully placed sleeping platform and fur covering acts in concert to sustain life. The shelter is no longer just a structure, it is a finely tuned survival system, tested and proven through weeks of blizzard, ice, and near constant wind. Even simple acts become vital strategies. Adjusting a fur's position to trap warmth, checking the fire before dawn, listen for signs of shifting snow, all a part of a larger survival equation. The mountain man moves through his space deliberately, each motion calculated to maintain the shelter's integrity and his own safety. There is no time for carelessness and no room for error. Winter allows none. Outlasting the mountain's harshest season requires humility. Nature is patient, indifferent, and unforgiving. Storms may rage for days without mercy, and yet survival is possible for those who respect the environment, anticipate danger, and manage every element of their shelter and their own body. Endurance is a measure of wisdom, vigilance, and careful labor. When the sun finally emerges, even briefly, it is both a relief and a reminder of what has been endured. Snow glistens in blinding white, the wind may have lessened, but the mountain winter is not yet over. The shelter remains steadfast, a testament to the mountain man's knowledge, preparation, and perseverance. Those who survive are the few who have learned the language of the mountains, who have lived within its systems, and who have outlasted the fury of winter. By the time the cold begins to ease, the mountain man emerges stronger in understanding, tempered by the season, and alive where many others have fallen. The shelter, the fire, the platforms, the walls, the vigilance, the knowledge, all have converged to preserve life through conditions that would have ended less prepared men in days or hours. Outlasting the winter that killed most men is not luck. It is the product of relentless preparation, constant attention, accumulated wisdom, and respect for the mountains. And when the first thaw arrives, there is quiet triumph in knowing that for weeks, perhaps months, the mountain man survived where so many did not, enduring a season that demanded everything and received only what he could provide. Life continues, cautious and measured, but triumphant. The shelter remains, the fire can be rebuilt, and the mountains, ever patient, await the next season to test those who dare to call this frozen wilderness home.